My name is Serafina the Masked Lady. I was once human. Since then, I have lived many lives. I have been loved and reviled, adored and despised, been the child of a poor prostitute and a courtesan revered by thousands. When I was a child, a stranger with no face offered me the ability to move between the worlds. Since then, my every death has led to a new life. I once had a true love. He was ripped away from me when I was murdered in the 18th century. I search for him still. In the meantime, I walk in the shadows behind the universe, visiting realms both exquisite and terrible and bringing back stories and rhymes to amaze the mind and enchant the ear. Through my YouTube channel, I send the stories out into the world, hoping that my true love will hear them and reply. Hoping, if he does not, that I will find in the other souls who listen kindred spirits to help ease the pain. What of you, stranger? Did you come here tonight seeking a mystery? Do you hunger for a spark of excitement, for the dark thrill of fear? Will you listen as my tales unfold, knowing that some may very well take on lives of their own? Consider, stranger, whether you have the courage to walk between the worlds with Serafina the Masked Lady. Hello, my delicious darlings, and welcome back to the channel. I have missed you all this week. I've been traveling a lot, and some of the worlds I've passed through have been very cold, both in weather and civilization. A world where friendship does not exist is a chilling proposition. Safe to say, it has reminded me exactly how lucky I am to have you. Today's story involves the creative process and the challenges that can arise when a person's living depends on the vagaries of their imagination. It is also about how easily dark powers can enter our lives. If you are sitting comfortably, then I will begin. If you aren't, well, grab a pillow, turn up the heat, and make yourself cozy. There's always time for a bit of comfort. A Deadly Inspiration. Chapter 1. J. Andrews had no respect for paranormal forces. He didn't believe in God, heaven, fate, or monsters. Still, looking at the squat creature slumped across his mahogany desk, he almost believed he had found the latter. The typewriter was ancient. Looking at it, Jay felt a vague, uneasy revulsion. The typewriter's body was black iron, broken by dark protrusions that had no discernible purpose but clustered across the gleaming skin like warts. The keys were brass, letters printed in faded enamel, and the teeth gave the disconcerting impression that it was grinning at him. His wife was visibly enraptured by the thing. "Well?" she asked expectantly. Jay paused. That was unusual for him. For a writer, he was an unusually blunt man. Under any other circumstance, he would have shaken his head, made some remark to soften the impact of the blow, and then said bluntly that the typewriter didn't suit him. But he and Margaret had been fighting. They had been fighting. Again. For weeks. The tension had been building between them, erupting sporadically into harsh words, showing in their children's faces, filling the 9-room house with the low hum of impending disaster. Even the animals had picked up on it. Then, the night before, the dark cloud had exploded. Jay didn't remember what he had said. He had been drinking most of the evening, and his head had been clouded by a pretty good Cabernet. He did know that it must have been pretty bad. He had spent the night on the couch tossing and turning on the ancient springs and had woken in a foul mood. Margaret was worried, and she was right to be so. In 4 months, the first draft of Jay's new novel was expected at the publishing house. A movie studio was bugging him about a screenplay, and a short story compendium commissioned last year by a private collector was going nowhere fast. Jay had tried, of course. He had sat up until the early hours staring at a blank computer screen, but all he'd come up with was the same series of panicked screams that were echoing in his mind. The novel was the most pressing thing. So far, Jay hadn't written a single word. He and Margaret hadn't spoken this morning. Jay had made his own breakfast and eaten it in the formal dining room, trying to ignore the bitter draft from the window and how it made him shiver. Margaret had risen later and gone out shopping. She had taken Jay's car without asking, leaving her house keys on the side. When Jay had seen that, he'd been half convinced that they were over, and the pain in his chest had felt like death. Just when Jay had begun trying to decide between calling the police and phoning his lawyer, the car had pulled back into the drive, and Margaret had climbed out. Jay had occupied himself in his office trying to look busy and was thumbing through some research when his wife walked in. He could tell that she had left early, without expensive makeup concealing the lines of tension that creased her upper forehead. She looked older and tired. Jay had looked away, back at the blank computer screen, thinking desolately of the days when the very sight of a blank page impelled him to create, filling his mind with 100 bubbling ideas. Now, each minute was a trial, each word an act of endurance that set up a low, throbbing ache in his temples. He'd expected Margaret to call him an ass for ignoring her. Instead, she had wrapped her arms around his neck. He'd still been blinking in confusion, braced for a slap and the pulling of hair, when she kissed his cheek and whispered, "I'm sorry." He had echoed her words, and then it was done. Over. After 20 years, it was that simple, or so he had thought. Until Margaret had run back downstairs. When she'd reascended, she'd been carrying the typewriter. "Well," Margaret said again. "Come on, how is it?" "It's..." Jay's store of similes failed him. For the first time in his writing career, he found himself wishing for a thesaurus. "Where did you get it?" "The new antique place in town. I was in there looking for something for Catherine's birthday, and it just jumped out at me." "What do you think?" "It's one of a kind. I don't think that I've ever seen anything like it. I knew that you'd like it." The smile on Margaret's face was radiant, taking 20 years off her increasingly matronly appearance, but as she spoke, the strain of what she was not saying wrinkled her brow. Drawing her forehead down, "I thought that perhaps it might help with, you know, the problem." The weight of her expectation was undiminished. It made Jay sigh. "Go on then," Margaret said. "What do you mean?" "Type something." "Oh." He reached forwards. It must have been a trick of the light, an illusion created by the soft, autumnal glow pouring through the bay window. Still, the keys seemed to ripple, the ornate letters glistening wetly. Jay shivered, seized by a premonition that if he touched them, those same keys would adhere to his flesh, refusing to release him. With an effort, he shook the thought away. Seconds later, his mind moved on to a new dilemma. What could he write? "How about get this fucking monstrosity off my desk?" his mind suggested. He ignored it. "I love you," he wondered. No, that sounded too cutesy, too insincere. "I'm sorry." He had already said it. There was a moment of uncertainty as Jay's hands approached the keys, a millisecond during which his body staged a revolt. Fingers clenched into fists, arms freezing, muscles seizing painfully until his entire body was gripped by an impossible paralysis. He fought it. He pushed forward against the invisible barrier, but it rebuffed him. He tried again, hoping that Margaret hadn't noticed the hesitation. "M-E-Y," he typed. No, that was wrong. Jay let out a low huff of frustration. He should have known. The keys were old. The pressure required to lift the typewriter's teeth was much greater than what he applied to the aging Mac that held his earlier works. He tried again, in halting capitals. "My wife is as beautiful today as she was the day I met her." Pressing the gold reset key, he watched the paper scroll into place and waited for Margaret's response. Stifled laughter rose from behind him. "Flattery will get you everywhere," Margaret said. She ran a finger gently across his shoulders, teasing, but when he reached for her, she stepped away. "Unfortunately, the kids want their dinner, so you'll have to wait for your reward." She laughed again. It was the first time Jay had heard the sound in, weeks, months. Too long, anyway. Hearing it, Jay made a decision. He would write with this thing, ancient or not, ugly or not. He would get rid of the computer today. If it made Margaret smile, then he would write articles, stories, damn it. entire novels on the typewriter. He would do it because he had to. He and Margaret couldn't keep arguing. He just didn't work without her. Chapter 2. When someone walked into his office at midnight, Jay was on his 15th page. It wasn't great stuff. Most of it wasn't even good. Resembling the halting compositions he had turned out during his early adolescence. Still, he was writing. He couldn't describe the relief he'd felt when the words had begun to flow, images following images into plots, subplots, and genres. Above that, beyond it, was the marvelously familiar glow of the unifying spirit that joined groups of letters to form the beginning of something that could be wonderful. To create a story. Jay had missed the feeling so much that it had been like suffocation. Now, finally, his chest no longer hurt. He could breathe. At this moment in time, Jay was not yet entranced. There was none of the old excitement, the giddy delight that arose when he discovered an idea unarguably worth the writing. It had been months since Jay had come close to that particular brand of elation. Longer still since he had experienced the thrill that came when he fixed on the great idea. When he knew that this one was special, that it would make the series, the movie, the bestseller. No, this was hard labor. Each word was an effort, each line an accomplishment, but he was writing. That in itself was a miracle. Hey, gorgeous. Jay had been aware of footsteps approaching his door, but he hadn't turned, assuming that Margaret had got out of bed for a drink. His wife was a very light sleeper. She often rose 2 or 3 times to fetch drinks or visit the bathroom. Usually, she returned to their bed as quietly as she had left it. He was surprised, therefore, when her footsteps entered the room. He turned towards her, grinning a welcome, but the smile froze and morphed into a grimace when he saw who was talking to him. The woman in the doorway was not his wife. The stranger was beautiful. She was also wearing Margaret's nightgown. Even as Jay darted out of the chair, struggling to understand how a woman who had to be mentally unstable had made her way into their locked house and removed the garment from his wife's wardrobe. He couldn't help but notice the swell of her small breasts beneath the thin material, nor the fact, though perhaps this was overstimulation of his renewed imagination, that the eyes that fixed on him were at once clearer and more profound than any he had ever seen. "Honey," the woman turned her head, stretching her body along the length of the door frame. "Are you coming to bed?" "Who are you?" Jay demanded. A look of bewilderment crossed the woman's face, followed immediately by amusement. "Oh, I get it. I haven't worn this nightie for a while, but it doesn't make much difference. You shouldn't be here." Jay tried to keep his voice calm. She frowned. "Where else should I be? How did you get into my house?" Her grin faltered, then rallied. "Through the front door." Jay edged around his desk. He'd put the emergency services on speed dial after an overzealous fan had broken into his car and filled it with torn-up copies of his latest novel. If he could just get there before the strange woman attacked him, he could summon help in a moment. Jay told himself that he was uneasy, not frightened. Not yet. His books were full of murderous minxes who stalked their hapless victims with the open intention of slaughtering them. In real life, whatever the tabloids might claim, that was seldom how things happened. The woman, whoever she was disoriented and confused. "I think you're in the wrong house," Jay said. "Come on, Jay. This is 452 Oakland Street. My name is Jay Andrews. Do you know what your name is?" "Jay, that's my name. I'm looking for yours." Jay paused. "Will someone be looking for you?" "Jay," there was an annoyance in her voice now. "It's late and I'm tired. Are you coming to bed or not?" "Not." "Fine." She turned and stalked away. For a while, there were noises downstairs. Shuffling. Stamping. A cupboard door slammed. Jay should have gone after the stranger. The woman could be doing anything, taking anything. Instead, he discovered a melancholy truth about himself. He was a coward. He would rather stand here and let a stranger steal half of their possessions than walk down those stairs and confront her. When he heard the front door slam closed, Jay found that he was backed up against his desk, a letter opener clasped in his hand. Relief flooded him, and Jay sagged down into his chair. It took him 5 minutes to summon the police. They responded quickly. Being a famous novelist had its advantages. Margaret was asleep, and the 2 officers took great pains not to disturb her. With the woman gone and no strange fingerprints left in the house, there was really very little that they could do. Jay gave a statement, careful to do so in a slow, methodical fashion that would belie any suspicion of drunkenness. The officers took down the details, thanked him for his report, and, as he did not wish to file a complaint regarding the theft of the nightgown, left a little more than 15 minutes after they had arrived. Chapter 3. Jay was at the typewriter before sunrise the following day. At first, the magic that had arrived with the machine prevailed. His fingers flew across the keys. Ideas poured through his body without asking permission of his mind. By 8 o'clock, Jay had the rough beginnings of a second chapter. As the sun rose, however, and the light sifting into the office defied even the thick curtains, his uncertainty began to return. His typing slowed. His heartbeat raced. The machine itself seemed to swell, its proportions becoming hideous and repulsive. Finally, when the pit of his stomach began to churn, he flung away from his desk, left the office, and walked into the kitchen. Margaret was there, standing in a shaft of early sunlight. She was washing the dishes. Behind her, Cassie and Kara were involved in a silent but determined battle over the last carton of orange juice. Greg, his 12-year-old son, was finishing a piece of homework that, he guessed, should have been handed in the day before. Fen, their oldest, had already left for college, the scent of her mother's most expensive perfume trailing provocatively behind her. "Daddy!" The twins launched themselves at his feet as soon as they saw him. 5 minutes were lost amidst the squeals of the diminutive 5-year-olds. As Jay stepped into the kitchen, the girls were already scaling his legs. Then there were the demands for hugs and kisses and the soft hint that 50 pence in tuck money would be gratefully received. By the time the brood had been packed into the nanny's car, Greg waving a sleepy goodbye past the remnants of a toasted cheese sandwich, Jay was already exhausted. Margaret, who had waved the kids off from the window, set down the last of the dishes with a sigh. "Hey, babe," Jay called, realizing that he had neglected to wish her a good morning. Filching a piece of toast from the rack on the table, Jay settled himself into the kitchen chair with a yawn. "Hey yourself," Margaret answered. "You sound tired." "Late night, early morning," Jay said. Inspiration struck. "Glad to hear it." Margaret nodded. Jay frowned. She was still facing the window. Looking at her, he noticed a difference, subtle but real. Her silhouette had altered. But how? For 5 minutes, as she washed and dried the drinking glasses, he struggled to identify the difference, emerging none the wiser. "Babe," Jay asked, "have you lost weight?" "Not that I know of." Margaret turned towards him. "Why?" Jay's heart stopped. "It's her." His wife was gone. It wasn't Margaret at his kitchen sink. Not Margaret, who had made breakfast. Not Margaret washing the dishes that they had picked out together when they'd been newlyweds. Too poor to afford anything but the cheapest set in the shop. But how? The woman sounded just like his wife. "Babe." The woman moved forward. "What is it?" "Is this about last night?" It was Margaret. The voice was the same, the movement, even the expression on her face. But her body. He remembered what he had written last night. "My wife is as beautiful today as she was the day I met her." Last night. He choked. Oh God. Looking for somewhere to direct his eyes, Jay glanced down at his hands and saw the reddened imprints of the letters on his fingertips. Was it the typewriter? The idea was preposterous. But it happened, didn't it? "I wrote something, and it happened." "You've written 15 pages today. If everything you write comes true, why is the place not full of goblins?" He searched his memory. His suspicion was impossible, of course, but there was no harm in proving that impossibility. What was different about last night? What had he done then that he had not done this morning? Nothing. The keys were the same, the place was the same. The gold key, I pressed the gold key. His heart sank. Is something wrong? Margaret laid her hand on his arm. The change hadn't affected the rest of the family. Only Margaret had been altered. The children hadn't noticed the change in their mother's appearance. They had accepted her. Either they were inattentive to the point of stupidity, or perhaps to them, there had been no change. As far as they were concerned, their mother had never been any different. And suddenly Jay remembered. He remembered Margaret at 20 years old when everyone had called her Maggie. He remembered her on the day that they had met. Her face had been red with sunburn, and her freckles had stood out like tattoos against the crimson. But soaring above them had been two eyes, the clearest, bluest eyes he had ever seen. The eyes had held the spirit he had fallen in love with. Those eyes were still there, as was the smoothness of skin and the lithe, firm body of a girl. Most men would have been overjoyed, as it happened. Though, Jay missed the lines. "Jay," Margaret asked. "No," he shook his head. "No, nothing's wrong, I'm fine." Chapter 4. When darkness fell, Jay went into his office. In the flicker of the firelight, he began to write. He was careful never to touch the gold button. He held out for a week. Chapter 5. Cassie screamed. She screamed and screamed and screamed. She screamed the morning into the afternoon, the evening into the night. She screamed, and she wouldn't stop. Margaret was at her wit's end. In the Andrews household, tantrums were far from unusual. Cassie was the more volatile of the twins. Her antics at ages 3 and 5 had given her parents a disturbing insight into the stronger passions of her approaching adolescence. Mostly, the outbursts were short-lived and followed with such sincere contrition that it was difficult to remain angry. No one knew what had sparked the fit, but their usual tactics failed. Even in the sprawling detached structure that was their house, Jay couldn't escape his daughter's cries. Impossible to ignore. Screaming in such frenzy that a more primitive culture would have declared Cassie to be possessed by demons. At midnight, Jay decided that it had gone on too long. He sat down in front of the typewriter. "My daughter never has tantrums," he typed. "She is sleeping quietly in her bed." His hesitation was brief but poignant. He pressed the golden button. Silence fell. Of course, he would never do it again. Chapter 6. Over the coming months, Jay made more alterations in his life. Subtly at first, then more openly. Greg stopped chewing gum. His grades improved. And if his old friends were worried about him, if his teachers found him dull and uncommunicative, it was better than complaints and detentions. Cassie lost interest in football and returned to the dolls that were more suitable for her age and gender. Margaret, who had once been his strongest critic and most demanding reader, became unfailingly supportive of every decision Jay made. She also fell pregnant. Everything should have been perfect. Chapter 7. By December, Jay was a wreck. He didn't know what was going on. Before the typewriter, life had been good. Its arrival had given him the means to iron out the last problems in his existence. So why was he unsatisfied? The kids had something to do with it. When Cassie petted her dolls sitting in the big easy chair in the front room, she did so not with joy but with an expression of confusion. If she looked at him, the eyes that had once sparkled with welcome now held only angry resentment. Greg ignored him. He didn't care for anything. Nothing could rouse even a passing interest. Nothing but his books. Jay didn't recognize his son. And Margaret. Margaret was the worst. She was radiant. 3 months gone, she was beginning to show signs of the new life within her. The child's presence had transformed her, suffusing her body with a beauty that belonged only to the youngest, the most vital women. Her smile was soft, and her voice was gentle. She supported Jay in everything that he did. But that was all that she did. It was all that any of them did. Badly drawn characters. They moved through their lives like the inhabitants of a penny, dreadful, empty, and spiritless. Jay was afraid. When the doors on Cassie's untouched advent calendar should have shown the passage of 10 days, he put the typewriter in the garbage. In the morning, it was on his desk. Terrified, Jay avoided the office for the day. When he finally returned, he was armed with pliers and a screwdriver. He disassembled the typewriter. Each part was disposed of separately. He sat up all night, hoping. Dawn came late, filtered through pallid clouds, and what little light there was gleamed dully on the typewriter's black shell. When trashing it with a sledgehammer failed, Jay succumbed to despair. On Christmas Eve, slouched drunkenly in an armchair while Margaret professed, in a dead monotone, the eternal continuance of her support, Jay realized what he had to do. He walked into his study like a man going to his own execution. He didn't sit. He stood before the desk and stared at the thing that had ruined his life. Slowly, hesitantly, he stretched his hand towards the typewriter. He wrote, "None of this ever happened." Chapter 8. Sandra Andrews lay back against the starched hospital pillow, fighting the waves of nausea that rippled across her body. The anesthetic was still wearing off, but the dull fire in her bandaged abdomen warned of worse pain to follow. She didn't care. It didn't matter. She had to know about her baby. "Miss Andrews." The doctor was young, but the expression of distaste as he spoke her name told her everything she needed to know. She had expected it. 16, unmarried, and pregnant in 1970s Britain was not a good combination. "How are you feeling?" the man asked. "Doctor, I'm sure you have been told there were complications with the delivery. You were bleeding internally. We had to do some surgical work. I'm afraid that I have bad news." She closed her eyes. "It's not as bad as it might have been. You are in no danger, but you won't be able to have more children. The pain of that loss might have crippled her. In her current distress, however, its impact was as a blow after a beheading barely noticed. I need to know. Your parents have been called. Please, where is my baby?" Perhaps something in her eyes reached the young doctor. Maybe he was merely tired of dodging the inevitable. Whatever the truth, he fell silent. His hand on her arm was the consolation that she feared. "I'm sorry, Miss Andrews, but we couldn't save the baby. Your son was stillborn." The doctor left her. In the great, white silence that remained, Sandra curled in on herself and wept, repeating over and over the name that would never now be known, never sung at birthday parties or chorused by groups of laughing friends. The name of her son. "Oh, Jay! Jay, Jay, Jay!" Well, what do you think about that? Did you see the end coming? What do you think of Jay? Did he get what he deserved? Was his arrogance in trying to edit his reality enormous enough to warrant deletion from the world, or do you feel any sympathy for him? What would you do if you had a typewriter that could change the world around you? How many of you would know how to use a typewriter? Go on, be honest. What would you change about your life if you could? I would write my true love back into my narrative, although I would be sure to keep all of you with me as well. I am hoping to find you some slightly longer stories soon. Do let me know if you enjoy them, or if there's anything else you would like to see on the channel. Until next time, keep safe, have pleasant dreams, and if you happen to come across any strange technology lurking in the shadows of an antique store, maybe you should leave it there.